All right, everyone, we are live. Welcome, welcome. I just want to make sure we are coming through on YouTube. Oh, yes, we are rocking. How are you doing, Don Don?
I'm doing fantastic. I am,
Brilliant.
yeah, why not?
Awesome. Uh, so we do have Dr. Dan Wilson in the listeners column. Dan, I'm just sending you an invite to speak. You just have to accept that invite to speak, and it will put you up here with Don Don and I.
I first of all want to say thank you for, doing this with me and letting me be a part of it. Of course, it's always a pleasure and always a gratitude. So,
Yeah, man. We're gonna get into everything today, really. And Dan, if you did join, if you're just on your desktop, you might have to get this app on your phone. But if it's not letting you accept my invite to speak, but yeah, I mean, today's episode, you guys, is the claim that I think myself, Don Don, and Dr. Dan Wilson are willing to make, which is COVID vaccines are still safe. Do you agree with that, Don Don?
I mean, yes, they're safe. Still safe is just like even an addition. It's not like anything has really changed to make them no longer safe.
Right. And what is the level of um, what is the anti-vax? What are you noticing in the anti-vax movement right now relating to COVID vaccines?
So I've actually personally, I've heard, so recently with this whole Justin Bieber fiasco, you've seen these people jump out of the woodworks, crawling out of their swamp or wherever they are, and reinvigorating myths about the vaccine itself. But generally, I've heard things like, "Oh, it's a tool to control the population. We don't really need it. They're just trying to send money to like big pharma and stuff like that." Is really what I'm hearing now.
Okay, interesting. I want to say hello to Dr. Dan Wilson. You just have to unmute yourself. Oh yeah, there you go. You got it. Welcome. Oh, dang. We're just hearing a static from your mic so far. But we'll get it figured out. Hmm. Are you hearing his voice, Don Don, or no?
No, I simply hear some static.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you might have to try rejoining Dan.
Now, this is probably great, honestly, in a call-in. Let the room fill up. You iron out the technical issues, get a full room going, and usually it works better than if you start with half a room and then as it grows, people don't even know what you're really talking about. So,
Yeah. Yeah, this is good. We can shoot the shit for a bit here. Well, Dan gets his stuff sorted. So I've seen, well, I know Dan posted about Jordan Peterson continuing to
yes.
pull at the heartstrings of these people with anti-vax tendencies, especially related to COVID. And I want to bring up uh, what Dan said here. So Jordan tweeted out. Um,
Is
Here,
that
let me
working?
pull this
Hello?
up.
Oh, did I
Oh
just
yeah,
hear
we
you?
got you. We got you.
Okay, cool. There we go. I just had to unplug my earbuds from my
Yes.
computer.
That might
Right.
work.
There you go.
Okay, cool. All right.
So, hey, welcome. You guys, Dr. Dan Wilson has his own YouTube channel, Debunk the Funk. Check it out. I think he's been uh, doing the work of the gods during the pandemic to, keep people informed and to call out any kind of pseudoscientific nonsense that we have heard during this pandemic, really confusing people about the safety of vaccines. Um,
Sometimes
the,
it feels like scrubbing the toilet.
scrubbing the toilet.
Sometimes.
Someone's got to do it.
So someone does have to do it. So, um, Dan, what has been, after it kind of, I don't know if you consider us in post-pandemic, wait, if this is endemic, where are we at now, and what are you seeing ideologically out there?
We're still in a pandemic. A lot of the world is still experiencing COVID surges, and lots of countries are still inadequately vaccinated. So they're going to continue experiencing deadlier surges until that gets changed. But it appears in America, at least, a lot of people seem to be done with the pandemic, and that's for what it's worth. Things in the U.S. have gotten a lot better than last year. We have a lot of cases, but we're seeing a lot less hospitalization, a lot less death, mostly in part thanks to vaccination. So ideologically, you see a lot of people being, I think, fatigued from the COVID pandemic, but still this loud minority of anti-vaxxers who are trying to keep that 30% of Americans from getting their first 2 doses and even more from getting their 3rd dose. So
What do you think of parents who are, keeping their children from getting vaccinated at this point?
I don't think it's the right choice.
Yeah.
The younger kids are the most poorly vaccinated age groups in the U.S., and children are vulnerable to COVID. It's less likely for them to have severe outcomes from it than older individuals, but they're not immune to it. And so if we just have that let her rip attitude of just allowing it to spread, that's going to be more suffering, more hospitalization, more illness, and more spread of COVID. And the more COVID spreads, the more likely it is that it's going to continue being a problem. It's going to continue evolving, and we're just going to have to keep dealing with it in ways that we shouldn't have to. So lots of reasons to vaccinate children. And I
Mhm.
personally will be getting my infant vaccinated as soon as our pediatrician gets their lots of vaccine in and available.
So, okay, thanks, Dan. Don, you and I just had a quick exchange. I had sent you an article about the anti-vaxxers using the Justin Bieber issue. I believe he's suffering from was it Bell's palsy?
No, Ramsey Hunt syndrome, from what I
Oh, okay,
know.
okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, so why don't you maybe talk a little bit about what you've found with these people jumping on that to try and, it seems like, try to create more hesitancy towards vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, that's what anti-vaxxers have been doing for a while now, right? Anything that comes up in the news that's medicine related or health related, people will just immediately say it's the vaccine. They were doing it when Bob Saget was when
Yep,
Bob Saget
AVs,
passed
man.
away. They did that. Yeah. Anytime an athlete in the news has passed away, they blame the vaccine, even though athletes have always died unexpectedly and made the news for it. And this Justin Bieber thing is just no different. He makes a TikTok or Instagram or whatever it was with Ramsey Hunt syndrome clear on his face, and they, without even knowing whether or not he got vaccinated, I don't even think we know when he got vaccinated or what his vaccination status was. Without knowing any of that, they just say, "Oh, it's the vaccine." No evidence, and it's just this big ploy to scare people. It's really weird, but it's a common tired tactic that they've been doing for a very long time.
Don, did you have anything to add there?
I think from everything that Dr. Wilson has been saying is obviously correct, and I think that a big reason for this is the profitability of like COVID scares. and just how the internet works and how the internet spreads its messaging. People like Dr. Wilson and people who do try to stand up to the and not be as sensational, it's hard for them to get much velocity with their claims and the truth as clickbaity TMZ type of things like Justin Bieber or Bob Saget or any type of ridiculous claim that this gets spread around. And that's a battle that's very hard to fight against. I find it actually quite absurd that 2 years later we are still having this conversation. More 3 years into COVID now, how long ever it's been that we're still debating on whether or not vaccines are safe.
Yeah, it's been like 2.5 years.
And look, sometimes people, they talk about this issue, and then they talk about it in some ways that it's like somehow just the illiterate that are getting this wrong. But no, my good friend Jordan Peterson is getting this wrong, and he needs to be called out and challenged about it, in my opinion. But before we get into that, because I think we should touch on uh, Dan, your tweet that you kind of gave Jordan a call out there, where he seemed to be misrepresenting or completely misunderstanding some new information that was being reported. But I want anyone, let's give priority to the callers today that have any level of vaccine hesitancy. Let's clear it up today. And not, you're not necessarily going to agree with what the panel has to say, or what the scientific consensus has to say, but I would like to hear your concerns. Let's deal with it. Let's engage in some constructive dialogue today. So do call in. We want to hear from you. Um, let's talk about Jordan Peterson. He's one of the most influential intellectuals on the planet right now, and he's been a perpetrator of, really stirring the pot in in kind of the anti-vax circles. They've kind of they keep screenshotting his tweets and using it to fuel whatever, the fear that they have, or the if there's an agenda of that too. um so yeah, what's this most recent thing that Jordan has gotten wrong, Dan?
Yeah, so he tweeted out a study. It's a preprint in the Lancet, so that means that it has not been peer reviewed yet. It's just been posted online, and it will be peer reviewed later and possibly published. And it's a study from some statisticians, some well-known names, including Peter Doshi, who's an editor of the BMJ. So on the surface looks legit, but this can be the tricky thing with dealing with some anti-vaccine misinformation, is that it can look legit. But what the preprint actually is it's an analysis of the clinical trial data for the Pfizer vaccines from over 2 years ago. These trials were the ones that recruited about 40,000 individuals, broke them up into placebo and vaccine group, and then found that the vaccines were safe and effective. At the time, about 90 to 95% effective against infection. And so they looked through that data, and they looked for serious adverse events. And what they're saying is that there were more serious adverse events in the vaccine arm than in the placebo arm. And based on that, in the preprint, they're saying that there needs to be some deeper study into this. And the big problem here is that these data are old. They're from a study that was not powered to investigate rare serious adverse events. So 40,000 people, it's good for determining like a preliminary efficacy number. It's good for determining general safety, general tolerability, but you're not going to detect those, 1 in 1 in 10,000, 1 in a million events until they roll out to the larger population. And now that they have rolled out to the larger population, there have been several surveillance studies to survey the populations that have gotten vaccines, compare the reported adverse events to baselines, to expected adverse events that should pop up in a population normally. And very consistently, several of these studies have shown that there's really not much to worry about. We found out that myocarditis can be a thing, but that's usually mild. It resolves on its own, and it happens generally with other vaccinations, and risks are greater with the virus. So other than that, we've found through these surveillance studies that they're very safe.
So why do you think that a PhD like Peterson got this wrong? What do you think was his missing? What are people, when they look at these studies, what's their failure in analysis, do you think, is what's happening here?
It's hard to know with Jordan Peterson. But maybe he didn't read it completely. Maybe he saw the headline. Maybe he has a preconceived bias to react to that kind of headline. I can't really say. But what's really dishonest from the authors, I think, what I was talking with some of my colleagues about this the other day when Peterson tweeted it, we just don't understand why they're looking at the clinical trial data and asking the question, what is the rate of serious adverse events? When we have huge data sets from billions of doses given to the population, that would be a lot better to study if you want to ask that question. It doesn't make much sense to compare groups in a study that was not powered to ask such a question.
I see.
And then, come up with an answer that's really speculative, saying we need to study this more. Well, we have. So that's strange to me.
On top of that, Jordan Peterson also, I think he tweeted this yesterday. He wrote, "Stunning, an experimental vaccine to protect children who are almost no risk from the disease." I think, as we spoke earlier, we spoke about how important it is to vaccinate children. What does the evidence show about the type of harms that children do get when they do get infected by COVID and it does harm them? Is it similar to the harm from adults? Is it related to long COVID? What specifically is it?
So the thing to know about children and COVID is that, one thing that we see more often in children than we see in adults is this thing called multisystem inflammatory syndrome.
Okay.
It's something that happens essentially. They get the virus, they get sick from it, they start to get better, and then they get this really severe inflammatory response a little bit later. And that can be serious. It can put them in the hospital. And you just don't want a kid that young to be in the hospital. But, people always say that COVID doesn't affect children. And as a parent, that's really annoying to hear. My wife and I, we have gotten vaccinated, so we feel better about, going places. Not that we can go many places with an infant these days, but with our infant unvaccinated, we just don't want to necessarily take chances. We don't want her to get infected and put her in harm's way without having that extra layer of protection. And our infant, she's healthy. We've gotten very lucky. She hasn't had any issues, but there are plenty of parents out there with vulnerable children who have conditions that they were born with, children that maybe are immune suppressed for whatever reason. Maybe they have cancer and they're they're vulnerable. Those parents are just, they want vaccines. They want to be able to protect their children. And so for people like Jordan Peterson or whoever to say that, to like downplay these vaccines for children, it's just really tone deaf, kind of ignorant in my opinion. You know, we want to be able to reduce risk to children as much as possible, and especially something people might not know is that among children, children aged 0 to 5 months actually make up the largest number of deaths in the ages 6 and below. There have been about 200 deaths of children 0 to 5 months in the U.S. COVID, and you could hear the number 200 and say, oh, that's not that many, and yeah, it could be worse, but that's still a lot of children that deserve to be protected. You don't want another 200 to die needlessly next year. So
What about the fact that vaccinating kids also reduces the spread to elderly population? I know most parents who have younger kids, elementary school age, especially when the summer is rolling around, are going to be sending them to summer camps. They're going to be spending a lot more time with their grandparents. Do you think this is warranted for like people getting a third dose or a fourth dose, especially if you're older, as efficacy wanes as time goes on?
yeah, so whenever I hear talk about efficacy waning, I think it's important to ask the question, efficacy against what? So, for example, if you're talking about efficacy against infection, yeah, that's going to decrease over time as your immune system contracts. Your immune system's not going to constantly produce a high level of antibodies that can neutralize the virus before you feel a little crummy and decide to get tested. But you're still going to be having that immune memory that can recall the encounter with the vaccine and enable itself to fight the virus. And it's that quick response that can help reduce transmission. So
Okay.
it's been measured in multiple studies that vaccinated people actually shed less infectious virus than than unvaccinated people. So, you might have heard headlines about how vaccinated carry just as much virus as unvaccinated. Well, the correct experiment really to answer the question of how much are they spreading is to measure infectious virus that they're actually shedding from their body. And when those experiments are done, it does show that vaccinated shed less. So it's not going to be 100%, but you're going to reduce likelihood of transmission by getting vaccinated. And that's going to help prevent a child from spreading it to possibly a grandparent. And if a grandparent wants to, be around children that may be getting exposed, it may be a fourth dose for them if they want. It's hard to know really how much benefit a fourth dose brings at this point. I don't think it's necessary for most people to get a fourth dose. But there are elderly members in my family who were traveling and thought about getting a fourth dose, and I said, yeah, it can't hurt. It can definitely help prevent you from that initial infection. Anyway.
So there's a lot of claims being made in the chat, guys, and I will definitely like you to call in. Sunny, IMO, Bloody, definitely give a call. So before you do that, I'm going to read something that I think who wrote Bloody wrote. He goes, where is this? He goes, Dr. Wilson is completely lying. The first COVID-19 test on animals failed and they all died. Do you have any idea what he's referring to, Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, that's a common claim. No. First COVID-19 tests, I'm assuming he means the vaccines. No, the animals did not die. They tolerated the vaccines pretty well. And the challenge studies on the non-human primates that were used in the preclinical trials showed that they were able to prevent infection of the non-human primates, prevent pathology when they looked at tissues, prevent symptoms, and the animals were tolerated. They tolerated it just fine. He might be referring to, I see a lot of claims about how back in the early 2000s, after SARS-1, there were attempts to make a SARS-1 vaccine. A lot of people like to claim that those studies killed all the animals. That's not entirely true. There were early versions of the vaccine where in challenge studies they saw something called antibody dependent enhancement, and that did cause problems for the animals.
And what is that? What's antibody dependent what behavior is that?
Enhancement. So
Enhancement, yeah.
That's a phenomenon where the antibodies produced by the immune system actually help the virus in its pathology. It helps the virus cause disease. It's rare. I can only think of, I can count on one hand how many examples I can think of that in connection to vaccines. But it was observed with early versions of the SARS-1 vaccine. But later versions, they essentially figured out what was the issue and fixed it. So there was a SARS-1 vaccine ready to go that was safe and effective by all their measures in animals in preclinical trials. But because SARS-1 fizzled out, pharmaceutical companies and governments were like, well, why do we need to donate, or why do we need to dump a bunch of money into something for a disease that's fizzled out? It's not there anymore. And scientists were like, no, but this could be really important. We could have a coronavirus vaccine. And yeah, it just didn't go further because there was no precedent, no pressure, no money. So yeah, that's probably
no real financing behind it.
Yeah, that's a little bit more than what he was asking, but that's probably what he was thinking about.
I see. And, so he's also saying in the chat, I mean, I wish you would call in. You should call in. But he was saying in the chat, has a survival rate of 98.9%. Right? Even if it does have a survival rate of 98%, what's the point of vaccinating? I believe that, when we look at a pandemic globally, we're talking about 300 million people. 1.2% is a substantial amount of human beings to want to protect.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of people. I mean, if 1% of the population died within a year, that would be huge. Be a huge number of people, a lot of loss. But when it comes to COVID, pre-vaccine, the rough numbers were about 20% of cases would end up in the hospital.
Okay.
And about 2% would die. Those are the rough numbers pre-vaccine. It varies by country. It varies by access to healthcare, things like that. But those are rough numbers. Even with those rough numbers, we saw hundreds of thousands of excess deaths. Those are deaths above what we would expect in a given year in the U.S. alone. So those small numbers, when a virus spreads to a lot of people, those small numbers become really big. And another interesting thing that I think a lot of people don't really realize is that polio, only about 1% of people who ever got polio ended up with a paralytic case. But polio was very widespread, and it caused a lot of damage, a lot of panic. Even in India, when it was at its peak endemic time, the number, I think it was something like 600 kids were getting paralyzed daily, something like that. I would have to look up the exact number, but it was a ridiculous number of kids who were getting paralyzed by polio daily with a 1% chance of that happening on average. So yeah, those small percentages just really add up when you talk about an infectious disease that spreads to a lot of people really fast.
That's just awful. Honestly, I can't imagine living in such a world. Really.
Yeah, I mean that's why we had such a big push to get polio vaccines, and why they were so readily taken by most people. We wanted to
What
get
do
rid
you
of those horrible cases.
what do you think is leading to this discrepancy? No, you look at polio, and it said the paralysis rate was 1%. So I'm sure that the death rate was probably lower. What do you think has changed about society that we actually find ourselves so not only so ill prepared for a pandemic, but at the same time so unwilling to recognize it as such?
Well, I think on one hand, you've always had these anti-vaccine sentiments, even back during the polio vaccine campaigns. There was anti-vax sentiment. Even during the early 1900s, in smallpox vaccination campaigns in America, there was a lot of anti-vaccine sentiment. And I guess concerningly, if you read what people were saying back then, it's really similar to what they were saying now. And I think the big difference now, obviously, is that we have the internet where these dissenting voices can amplify themselves and just, find communities, organize, and really pump out a lot of misinformation that seems convincing. So that is kind of a downside, kind of a gloomy look at it. But
Yeah.
one positive that I'd throw in there is that during the polio vaccine campaigns, it took decades for vaccination rates to reach, that 70, 80, 90%, those benchmarks. Decades. And now, in an age where misinformation and disinformation spread so much more easily, we've reached, in most countries that actively vaccinate, we've reached about 70% in less than, I think we reached that point in about a year and a half, less than 2 years, we reached that
That
point. So
is
that's
incredible.
encouraging. That's encouraging. We've still got a lot of work to do, but that's definitely a brighter side to it.
All right, guys, we have our first caller. I want to take Mr. You just have to click your icon and unmute yourself, and then you will be live. And feel free to say what you want to say.
It's Grim. It's Mr. Grim. Hey,
Oh,
bud.
hey, Glenn.
Hey, so kind of simple. Do you feel that there's alternatives to vaccinations?
Alternatives in what context?
Sure. What about natural immunity?
Oh, okay. So usually, I don't want to assume what you're saying, but usually when people talk about natural immunity, they're saying something like, I've had COVID or I've had it twice, why do I need to get vaccinated? And the answer is that vaccination actually adds a lot to someone's immunity, even though they've been infected. There have been direct comparisons of people who have a history of SARS-CoV-2 infection and no vaccination, or a history of SARS-CoV-2 infection and they got vaccinated. And the vaccine adds a lot to the immunity. And the reason is that once your body sees something once and has an immune response to it, that's one thing, that's one encounter. But if you then add another encounter, in this case in the form of vaccination, that's going to cause your immune system to recall And as a result, you can think of it as basically saying like, oh, I'm seeing this again. That means I'm probably going to see it again in the future. So I better, beef up my response. I better beef up my defenses. And, that's basically what happens. Your B cells have this process where they continue to expand the repertoire of antibodies to encompass, in the case of SARS-CoV-2, every variant that we've seen so far. Whereas natural immunity or immunity gained by infection, we've seen it's not really doing that. And it's adding the risk that an infection brings. So I don't think that natural immunity is an alternative to vaccination.
Okay. Is it always the case, or is it only the case when you are going to most likely survive from the infection and possibly have long-term positives to your immune system for natural immunity?
I don't know of any evidence that suggests that an infection is going to bring long-term benefits to your immune system. At least none that can't be gained by 3 doses of mRNA vaccine.
Interesting. I mean, I have a few more questions, but I don't
No,
want to take
no.
up too much time.
Grim,
Okay,
Grim,
I mean, that's fine.
you just go ahead. You have the floor, man. Just go for
No,
it.
that's fine. Okay. Well, I'll let you know a little bit about me. So I'm fully vaccinated from a child and I'm close to 40. So we didn't actually have a lot of vaccines growing up. And my mom was also vaccinated. She's got some interesting things. I mean, when we were doing vaccines about 30 years ago, it was a little rough, right? I mean, we're actually causing damage to people's immune systems and making marks on their body and whatever. But the benefits always outweighed, what we were doing to people. And then eventually we had a vaccine board and all the other fun things in politics and business and liabilities that we could work in. So then I've got 3 kids. And it's kind of interesting the way the vaccine conversation goes in our household, because it turned into mom and dad are fully vaccinated. My oldest kid is not fully vaccinated in a way because the way that hospitals throw vaccinations, it's like everything that they can throw in underneath the sun these days. So she has some vaccinations. My son is very little vaccinated, and my daughter is not vaccinated whatsoever at all. And so you can kind of see over the years our distrust of vaccinations. And the reason why has to do with the science. I love the science. I am a fan of it. And I also work in risk and liability. So I see these things on a very large scale. And it came down to the people behind them. It came down to, I really want to know your opinion on the vaccine boards, on how these companies cannot be held liable. And then specifically, what's your opinion on how they change that process for COVID so that claims can only be within a year. They don't pay for lawyer fees for injuries. And there's very little information like what we just got released on, I think it was Pfizer, on all of their information on what we're now discovering, how they put together these vaccines. And then lastly, I'd like to get your opinion on how the FDA is escaping liability altogether by making these vaccine companies do their own clinical trials and come up with their own studies.
Okay. Yeah, so I totally understand being concerned about the people behind the vaccines. I guess the first thing you asked about, remind me which one that was.
The first thing I talked about, about the
you had 3 questions. If you just break those up into like
what's your opinion? What's your opinion about VAERS, the Vaccine Injury Board? So, okay. What's your opinion there? And then what's your opinion on this special type of VAERS that we have, which is if you have a COVID injection, then they restrict that to a year you can claim. No, they don't pay for your lawyer, anything like that. And then lastly, my question is, what's your opinion on these companies that are basically, and the FDA, that are basically curtailing liability and people that are getting severely injured and not getting compensated, or
Right.
this
So,
information isn't being released to the populace.
okay. So by VAERS, do you mean the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act?
Yes.
Okay. So the VICP, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So I think it's helpful to kind of understand the history of that. So I think it was back in forgetting if it was the 60s or 80s, but it's not important. There were basically a lot of claims at that time that pertussis vaccines were causing encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain. These claims were kind of running wild, and the pharmaceutical companies were getting a lot of lawsuits against these pertussis vaccines. And so, vaccine companies don't ultimately make a ton of money off of vaccines relative to what they normally make money on. So, just thinking about the math of that, if you take a pill every day and you have to get that refilled every month, you're paying for that every month, whereas vaccines, you get your like 3 to 5 dose course depending on the vaccine, and then that's it for most of them for your life. So they make a lot more money off other medications. So because of all those lawsuits, vaccine companies have actually just said, okay, we're not going to make these anymore. And so then the government stepped in and said, wait, you can't not make them. We need to vaccinate against pertussis. It's a very serious disease. So they set up the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program so that people, ordinary citizens, could file claims and have the government deal with them of injuries. And so that the pharmaceutical companies wouldn't have to bear the brunt of that. Now, that doesn't mean that pharmaceutical companies are free of all liability. They are still obligated to put out a safe and effective product. And if they don't do that, then they can be federally sued and reprimanded and have their products taken off the market, have their products reputations destroyed, those kinds of things. And a pharmaceutical company doesn't want that to happen in their best interest. It takes billions of dollars just to get a product from the bench to the bedside. And so if a product made it to market and then the FDA came down on it, that would be a huge loss for the pharmaceutical company. They don't want that to happen. Now, I know that you could probably say that FDA is, being bribed by them or brought out. Maybe some people would say that that's, a conspiracy theory, plain and simple. And you have to have evidence of that for me to take it seriously.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't think that there's no conspiracy there for sure. I think that there's an issue when there's no accountability, and when you don't have the free market as it does in everything else, right? Try to wean out bad actors. And my issue with that is that the FDA, even as they go through VAERS and the compensation, we're all paying this compensation. It's a tax added onto the vaccine. Yes. And so it's not out of their money, it's out of our money. And at the same time, the FDA is making the pharmaceutical companies do their own third-party trials, and then the vaccine company is the one that actually gives the data to the FDA. And so the FDA has wording that releases them of liability when there's an issue with the vaccine.
Yeah, so the FDA has to be an outside party that is going to regulate vaccine companies. So when a pharmaceutical company, for example, does a clinical trial on vaccines, it actually involves, not just the tens of thousands of patients, but also it involves multiple sites, multiple other companies that they contract different tasks in the clinical trial out to. It's a big process that involves a lot of different people. And then all that data comes together and then gets sent to the FDA for review. I guess I don't really see a problem with a third party like the FDA reviewing the data that pharmaceutical companies produce for their products.
I would say the problem I'm having with, and that's the big controversial news now, is that they're not getting that information. They're not getting the like 3,000 pages that these trials had. So like they're getting a synopsis from the pharmaceutical company of like, this is how many people were injured based off our trials. This is how many died, and very simple, quick synopsis. And then they're approving the drug. The drug is released only for a year or two later for them to get the full review of everything, and they're still not reviewing them. And so this is becoming a huge issue when we want vaccines to do the right thing. We want them to work, and we have this system that is kind of corrupting the process.
Okay, so I think I know what I think you're talking about the Pfizer documents releases that have been happening over the past few months.
That's an example of what has been happening behind the scenes, and only because COVID has been, so big and everything, we're actually realizing what's been going on inside the FDA for so long.
Right. So that's an example of what you're talking about. Okay. So yeah, those documents that are getting released are actually what was sent to the FDA for review. What happened was Pfizer gathered all these documents, sent them to the FDA for review, and then those documents are, belonging to the FDA, and they can be released with a Freedom of Information Act because they are technically, the public has a right to see those documents. But yeah, so that's what happened. There was a Freedom of Information Act to see all of the documents that Pfizer submitted to the FDA for approval. And the reason they're getting released like in batches is because there were so many documents and they all had to be redacted for mostly patient information and any kind of like proprietary information that the lawyers thought was proprietary, and so they all had to be reviewed.
would not be under the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah.
Right.
So like personal patient information and like company private information, proprietary to their products or their processes. So that all has to be redacted by an office, reviewed by lawyers and whatnot, and then released to the public. So that's what we're getting in batches. And, I've been paying attention to those. I've been seeing them. And my takeaway from all of that, in short, is that we've learned really nothing new from those documents. Everything that has been highlighted and talked about has been stuff that we've known from the clinical trials. Just maybe different details that are easy to misinterpret. And that's what I see in a lot of headlines.
I think there was an issue, I think, where, and I could look it back up again, where one of the patients from that trial had an issue, I think intestinal issue. She was seen by a doctor, and the trial company that they went under, which doesn't exist anymore because they simply pop up these companies that run trials, and then sometimes it goes away. Some of the trial services have been around for a few decades. Apologies for the child in the background.
That's okay.
Running my own trials here. So what? One of the ladies that had a COVID vaccine, all they said is that she had abdominal pain. She ended up actually being paralyzed over the trial. And so they were like, well, listen, if they knew that and they released that, it would have affected something like 10% of the people, right? Would have been, it wasn't 10%, I think it was 2% of the people that took this would have had some extreme discomfort, possible paralyzation, things like that, which was conducive to some of the symptoms and things that we see. But we don't get that information because a lot of that is sealed by VAERS and is sealed by. We had to actually get these documents to figure out, like, how are they reporting to the FDA of what happened to these people in the clinical trials? And then what does that really look like in 3,000 pages of documents? And then what does that look like, 6 months to a year later when we revisit these people and say, hey, what is happening? And we get their point of view that has been part of these trials. And the problem is that a lot of this stuff isn't adding up. I started to look towards European understanding in vaccines, and they seem to be backing off drastically in how they're administering vaccines because they're realizing bureaucratically there's a lot of issues. The adjuvants, there's a lot of issues. And so I'm not against vaccines. I'm against this Western medicine concept that pushes all these things like this is for the greater good. And we're finding out that there's no accountability, no liability, and no transparency. I want things that work in my life. I want to be safe and I want to be secure, but I need those things in order to trust that.
Okay, yeah. I would pose to you that, those answers are out there. You can find them. There is a level of transparency and accountability that I think works. For example, we saw it with COVID vaccines. We saw 2 mRNA vaccines and 2 adenoviral vector vaccines roll out around the same time. So we had the Pfizer Moderna mRNA vaccines, and we had the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca adenovirus vector vaccines. And as I was saying earlier, when Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines rolled out to millions of people, then we started to see a literal 1 in a million chance of this thrombotic or blood clot event occur, mostly in women. And I think it did end up killing about 9 people in the US or worldwide, one of those 2 figures. And they paused the rollout. They paused the rollout of Johnson & Johnson in America. It was a big news item, and it was investigated. It was learned that yes, it probably is caused by the vaccine. Here's what happens in this case, and doctors now be aware that this is happening, and here's how to treat it. They paused it, figured all that out, and then continued the vaccination. And the problem has been not as big of a deal now that there's more knowledge of what to look for and how to treat it.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you, Mr. Grimm. Really appreciate the call. Lexicon, I am gonna jump you. We're gonna go to Blatty next, but we will get you.
Oh no, I think Lexicon has a short. I think he likes.
Oh, did he have something quick? Oh,
yeah,
okay,
he does have. He has something short, and then I think Blatty will. It's only fair. He's been waiting.
Okay,
right?
cool. Yeah, you're right. And I just want to encourage everyone else. Jump in. Do you have any disagreements? Do you agree with some of the things you heard? Do you have any more insights relating to the topic of vaccines? Jump in. It looks like we have a really good lineup coming up here, so this is exciting. All right, Lex, you're live.
Hey, Dan. When back in January when I got COVID, I wanted to get the vaccine after the fact, but I know you got to wait between vaccine doses, so I was concerned with whether or not being actually sick with COVID was the same thing. So I went looking for papers involving hybrid immunity and stuff like that. And a couple of them that I found discovered that if you only get the vaccine and you don't encounter COVID, it's got a waning efficacy over time throughout your lifespan. If you get hybrid immunity, which is where you get sick, survive, and then get the vaccine after the fact anyways, you actually slowly gain immunity even over time, regardless of whether or not you get vaccinated again, and for some reason your body doesn't forget. And then if you're a breakthrough case where you get vaccinated and then you eventually get COVID, the your resistance remains static and doesn't deplete over like a 20-year period.
20-year
That was
period.
it. Yeah.
How could
So
they
a
have tested a
combination.
20-year period with the
Yeah,
COVID
but
vaccine?
the other interesting thing is infection, no vaccination, also has a waning efficacy over time. So the
Oh,
combination of the two is actually vastly superior to one or the other, depending on the order in which it happens. And I still have not been able to find any evidence on whether or not it is safe to get the vaccine immediately following being sick. Nobody seems to have that answer. That's all I got.
yeah. So I guess you said that there's no other vaccine that wanes over time. Um, that's so wane against what? You know, like what we were saying earlier, efficacy against what? Wane against
I believe it's
what?
I believe it's specifically severe symptoms like hospitalization, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Um, so not immunity to infection, but immunity to well, immunity is the wrong word, but less likely to receive extreme symptoms that require hospitalization. At
Okay.
least that's what the papers I found spoke on.
Okay. So yeah, there are vaccines that um, become less effective over time. Uh, so, for example, flu vaccines, you get one every year. Uh, Diphtheria, Tdap, sorry, tetanus, pertussis, and diphtheria vaccine, Tdap shots, you get every 10 years. And we don't fully know. So over time, there are some vaccines. Yeah, I'm thinking of pertussis that can really wane over time in terms of protection against disease. Um,
Um, I just wanted to bring that up. If you're curious, the study is from Nature. I dropped in the chat. You can find it at your leisure later. You'll probably make more
okay.
sense of it than I would.
Yeah,
Have a good
I've
one.
seen. Okay, sure. You too.
What were you going to
Uh,
say there, Dan? Go
I was
ahead
gonna
and
say.
finish. Yeah.
I was gonna say that yeah, the whole thing about hybrid immunity is, you know, basically that the point is that 3 doses of COVID mRNA vaccines mimic hybrid immunity. So, yeah, it really comes from that repeated exposure, repeated recall to an antigen. The immune system is really amazing in that way that it can see the same thing and then get better at responding to different versions of it. So,
Okay.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, three doses look like hybrid immunity in a lot of the cell-based and antibody-based assays that have been done to measure the immune system of those kinds of individuals.
All right. Okay, we got Blotty up next, and big shout out to Blotty for jumping on the call today. Blotty, welcome. What's on your mind? Hopefully, we got good connection. Oh, Blotty going once.
All right, I'm here.
Oh, there he
Yeah,
is.
how's everyone doing?
Good. How are
My
you?
Hey, good.
question to Dr. Wilson is: if the vaccine, when you took the first one, and in that sense, the second one, if it's so good, then why is it a problem that we need to take boosters? I've never heard of any other, uh, maybe COVID or SARS, that you needed to take some kind of booster. Why do you
Okay.
need so much drug in you, so much vaccine in you?
So, have you looked at the CDC immunization schedule?
No, go ahead.
So, for hepatitis B vaccines, you get 3 doses. For pneumococcal conjugate vaccines, you get 4 doses. For Haemophilus influenza vaccines, you get 3 to 4. For hepatitis B, you get 3. They're almost every single, for polio vaccines you get 3. For almost every single vaccine dosage regimen involves at least 3 doses. So it's common.
So what does that
It's
mean that the rest
really
of the?
common.
Go ahead.
So what it means is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where when your body encounters something once, it has an immune response, but if it only sees it once, think about it like, imagine that you're the immune system and you're trying to be efficient with your resources. You see something once, you get an immune response to it. You're like, okay, we saw that. That was weird. Don't know what it was, but we saw it. We got it. You see it again, you're like, oh man, this guy's still around. We better, like, really beef up our defenses and make sure that we're ready for him when he comes again, because we already saw him twice. And then you get a third dose. Your body's like, okay, we got this. We are.
Real quick, Bloody, is there any way you can mute yourself in between talking as
Yeah.
we're getting a lot of background noise coming in? Thank you. Continue, Dr. Wilson.
Yeah. So that's kind of like a, analogy, a way of thinking about this. But what's really happening is every time your body encounters this stuff, you have memory immune cells that will get activated again whenever they see the contents of the vaccine again. And it's like training. It's like a training process. They'll continue to get better. So, and after 3 or 4 doses, that's usually a sweet spot to where your body has developed a robust enough immune memory that it can last and be able to prevent severe disease for a really long time, ideally a lifetime. Hopefully that makes sense.
It does make sense. I understand for certain for certain viruses. You mentioned the pneumococcal. You mentioned the hepatitis, which of course, thank God, they're nothing like COVID. At that, pandemic. They caused a pandemic. They're only for those individuals that get it for, what is it? The ones that get hepatitis, these are drug users, right? I'm not sure if it's hepatitis A or B.
I think everyone gets hepatitis I vaccines
Sexually
for
promiscuous people.
hepatitis.
Yeah, everyone gets hepatitis vaccines. Everyone gets pneumococcal vaccines. These are all part
there's
of
a certain group that is more prone. Go ahead.
Well, there are always going to be people who are more vulnerable to disease than others, but these vaccines I'm talking about are part of the childhood vaccine schedule. These are standard, given across the board.
Right, Bloody. So these vaccines that he's speaking about are so commonplace. It's actually commonplace with vaccines to have a regimen of first, second, third doses. We would,
But the
actually be
question is,
out
are
of the norm to have vaccine once and that's it.
But is it the
Yeah,
question
and
now is,
sorry,
are they
correcting
also
myself. The Tdap
mRNA?
vaccine is 5 doses in the initial regimen, or it's like every 10 years.
But my question is, are they also mRNA, or are they traditional vaccines that is not mRNA?
And if I said 3 doses for the polio vaccine, it's actually 4.
Okay. So, Dr. Wilson, I think Bloody, maybe your background noise was distracting, but I heard your question. I'll repeat it. The question was, does the difference between mRNA vaccines and these other vaccines make a meaningful difference in the fact they would either need a regimen, multiple vaccines? Does that even have an effect on the number of vaccines one needs to get to have proper mitigation?
Well, it affects it in a way that makes it better. So, coronaviruses are usually hard to vaccinate against, but mRNA vaccines are working really well. They do what normal vaccines do, and they do it very well. And if normally a vaccine regimen is 3 to 5 doses, and we're seeing really good efficacy that is pretty durable and instilling a really good immune memory at 3 doses of mRNA vaccines, that's really good.
And Dr. Wilson, what about the countries like Sweden that refused to vaccinate and they went with herd immunity, but they fared well in comparison to other Western and European nations?
Sorry, what was the first part of that before you said herd immunity?
The countries like Sweden that refused to vaccinate, or they made it optional, and they decided to take the road of herd immunity, developing the defenses through population and stuff, and they fared pretty well in comparisons to us. Their numbers were less in deaths, and they proved that we don't need the COVID-19 vaccination.
Well, Sweden is vaccinating their population. Initially, they didn't really have a great response to COVID, and as a result, in 2020, they did have high excess death numbers relative to their comparable neighboring countries. But right now, they're at 74% fully vaccinated in Sweden. So the idea of going with herd immunity is not good. Again, like I said earlier, this let her rip mentality, just let disease spread. Not only is that going to be bad for countries as a whole, but it's going to hurt the most vulnerable people the most. And so I don't think it's a good thing to advocate for.
I would also like to add that I think when you look at Sweden's, I think at the video you're talking about, I think it's one that was propagated by PragerU, and only about 2.5% of Sweden's population have actually even had COVID. So most of the quote unquote herd immunity, as Dr. Wilson said, has come from them being vaccinated as a nation. So I think that is a bit of misleading information you were privy to.
And I think Bloody mentioned hydroxychloroquine in the chat. Dan, is there any good evidence that hydroxychloroquine is effective against COVID?
No, there's not. It's been tested in several randomized clinical trials now, and none of them have shown efficacy. It's shown there were some maybe hints of efficacy in early retrospective and observational studies, which those studies are useful, but they're not the final say. You always have to ideally follow up with clinical trials, and the clinical trials just showed that it doesn't work. It just doesn't work against COVID.
But what about the famous doctor, I think from New York, New Jersey, Dr. Vladimir Zelenko, who treated over 1,000 people? He used the Zelenko protocol and hydroxychloroquine. He was successful, yet they went after him even for not using vaccination or any other therapy.
Yeah, I think he says that he was successful, but when people try to replicate his findings in, for example, clinical trials, they can't. So if you can't demonstrate consistently that a drug works, then it probably doesn't work.
All right, we got a long list of callers here. Bloody, thank you so much for calling in. Really appreciate it. Give a thumbs up for Bloody, guys. We got Britt next. Britt, you're up.
Thank you, Bloody.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here.
So I guess I don't know if this is going to be a lot of questions or a lot of commentary, having a lot of experience on the vaccine hesitant side myself. But I guess the first question I would ask is, when you're speaking on this topic, are you speaking kind of from the place that you're trying to explain what's best for the general population, and you're not like in lieu of what's best for every single individual?
So,
like, are you generalizing, to make it short?
So I think the way I think of this is I'm talking about what's the road that involves the least amount of risk. And so that's what I'm going for. So I'd say generalize. I'm generalizing, but that's ultimately what I'm talking about or what I'm going for when I try to explain these things.
I think that makes a lot of sense, especially as an expert yourself. That's kind of the mindset that you would be just accustomed to having by nature of what you're kind of aiming to do. But I think when you're worried about the thing yourself, you're coming from an individualistic perspective, which by nature would in some cases be paradoxical to what's best for the general population, because of course generalization assumes uniformity where we know that every individual circumstance is different. And so I think that that's a big disconnect when people are talking about this. I know I definitely fell on that side of the fence for a very long time. And what it does is it sets you up, and I'm sure you would be familiar with this, but it sets you up in an almost like a survivalist mindset where any opinion that kind of diverges from what your particular individualistic concern is kind of deemed as kind of too scary to really consider and take in. And so then it creates like a really big bottleneck communication wise.
I think I know what you're saying. I understand very much how, something like vaccination could be very scary to someone who maybe has had a genuine vaccine injury or witnessed one, even to someone who thinks that they have witnessed or experienced one. I try my best to be sympathetic toward that, and I wouldn't call those people anti-vaxxers or get upset with them or anything like that. The thing I have the least patience for are people who actively, will go on public platforms and try to spread disinformation. But I genuinely do understand the anxiety that can come with these things. I used to be really anxious about flying, for example, flying in airplanes. I would genuinely get panic attacks the night before a flight. I would not be able to eat the day of the flight. I would be a wreck. Even though I knew that millions of people fly in a year, I knew that it was the safest way to travel. None of that mattered to me because there was just something about it that terrified me. So, but I had to do a lot of work to really work away at that anxiety. So I know it can be really hard. It's easier said than done, and it's complicated for vaccines. I don't know what approaches people might take to conquer a fear of vaccines. I can talk. I know what I did to address my fear of flying, but yeah, it's complicated. I wouldn't discount someone who claims to be a vaccine injured person. I wouldn't try to demean their experience.
Do you recognize that the situation, unfortunately, has been politicized to the point where fears regarding kind of other situations have now bled into the idea of taking the jab? Like, there's many people, and I think probably most people are people who don't come from a science, like a more scientific background, and so they're having to rely completely on faith. And when you don't see faith in any of the institutions around you, it can become very difficult to have faith in another field that you aren't personally familiar with. It's kind of like, do you see like the survival kind of threat that might arise in that scenario?
Yeah, I totally understand that. And I think that scientists need to take responsibility a lot for communication during the pandemic. It's a tough job, a really tough job to communicate accurate information at a time when information is so dynamic. We were learning about the virus more and more every week. Early in the pandemic, it was really hard to give clear and concise messaging that wasn't going to change in a few months.
It's the nature of the
It's a-
beast.
Yeah, it's the nature of the beast. It's a tough job. It's really hard to communicate to the public, like, hey, this is what we know now, but it's probably going to change, and how do we communicate that without seeming like we don't know what we're talking about, but also reassuring people? Like, it's really tough. So I totally understand the decrease in trust.
I can completely understand that perspective, especially when you are in that place of authority. I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with that, because I think that's what you are supposed to do when you're in that expert role. I think a lot of the problem came from kind of individuals wanting to get in on it, and us kind of becoming tribal and adding all of these weird political things into it that had nothing to do with the vaccine at all. And so I think sometimes it's helpful when engaging in these conversations just to continue to reaffirm the fact that you're stating that it's what's best for the general public, and not necessarily that you're not necessarily support. I mean, I understand why you wouldn't want to say that, especially as an expert, but in just day-to-day conversations, when you're trying to connect with someone, it's helpful to mention that, yes, I am just speaking of what's best for the general population, and this doesn't apply. That doesn't mean I support what the government has done. I mean, who isn't embarrassed by our government system at this point? I think we actually all agree on that, and I think it's just not recognizing that kind of shift in dialectic that drives most of the miscommunication.
Yeah, it's the politicization has been terrible, and I don't really take pride in my political leaders, but it's a good reminder to try and find middle grounds, and come off as more, not as forceful, I guess, is what you're saying.
Because you need that, and when you're in the survival perspective, you need the subtle cues, because anything else, it rattles you more, like if you're actually fully in that state. And so people don't necessarily know that. We don't talk about it all that much in society. So I think increasing education on that particular aspect would be extremely helpful in this situation. Having kind of gone through it myself, it wasn't as clear as I would have liked it to be, but I don't regret that or anything.
No,
I think you hinted something really, really nice there, Brittany, is that in many respects, when we do try to value things, we have to recognize our biases, whether it's distrust in authority, being upset with our government, and kind of trying to make compartments within ourselves, kind of isolating and not letting our emotions and our fears take over our entire cognition. And I think it's also true for someone like Dr. Wilson's position to make a note of it. We should also, as individuals, strive for that in generally.
Absolutely. I think it's really helpful as an especially if you're coming from that individualist, more survivalist perspective, to always try to separate like kind of mind from reality, and make sure that you can see the distinct differences so that you can compare and contrast them. And that applies in any scenario, but especially when you're miscommunicating or when you yourself are scared, it can provide that kind of sense of relief and order that you're actually looking for as well, which helps regulate your nervous system or whatever it is.
And in many ways, we also have to recognize that we're not just individuals surviving, we're communities surviving. And many a times, the solutions of communities might not be ones that we individually feel are right for us. But from a community perspective, they are right for our whole survival.
Yeah. It's important to recognize the paradox, because the individualistic need it isn't always going to be compatible with the collective. And if we recognize that, then we can communicate better about it, and we'll find that we don't disagree about nearly as much as we think we do.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
All right, Britt, amazing stuff as usual, of course. Thank you so much for calling in.
Thanks for having me. Have a good night.
Good night. You guys hit that thumbs up for Britt. Make sure you subscribe to the Pangburn Hangout. We are live every day with a new discussion. Special announcement, tomorrow I will be speaking with Noam Chomsky on the Pangburn podcast at 3 p.m. Pacific time. You can join me at youtube.com/Pangburn. We're going to be getting back to the basics of philosophy. I'm going to get Noam's responses to some of the most basic philosophical questions we have. So join us 3 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow at youtube.com/Pangburn. We got Emma next. And you guys, I think we will call the program after Jason. Jason will be our last call. Emma, go ahead.
Well, good evening, everyone. Travis, I got to say, I don't know how you're going to get Noam Chomsky on there, but that is a must listen. I will certainly be tuning in. That's incredible. Good
Right on.
stuff.
Thanks.
So this is a question for Dan. As someone who's pretty abreast on this topic and who's someone who's clearly knowledgeable with different perspectives on it, I'd like to challenge him in quite a few respects. So I've been tracking this stuff pretty closely. So I guess more relevant question, a more recent question to Dan is, if the vaccines are so efficient and so effective, why was the Johnson & Johnson delisted on May 5th?
So delisted.
All right,
in
so
America?
so let me give you some guidance. So on May 5th, the FDA dropped guidance for providers, and they suggested the providers stop issuing the Johnson & Johnson due to adverse effects on individuals in traditionally healthy categories. And so basically their guidance was stop issuing it. If they have alternative options, give it to them. Don't give them the J&J. The interesting data set that I took in during that process too is I tracked locally how long those providers were still issuing the Johnson & Johnson during that time frame. And it wasn't until just 2 weeks ago where they stopped offering it. So for a period of over 30 days, local providers were still offering an option that they knew was dangerous and ineffective to a traditional healthy demographic, and were knowingly doing so. And so we continue to see this trend as we get new information. That very information isn't being utilized to make new decisions. That's my main concern in general, right? So that's one small data set. I could go on, I've got a ton here. I've been sharing a bunch of links in the chat. People feel free to open them up, do your own research. The most recent one that just dropped from June 15th from the New England Journal of Medicine, which is by far arguably the most respected journal out there for this stuff, basically showed these mRNA shots are ineffective. They don't work. So here's a data set. Natural immunity, after 12 months, your efficacy is still over 54%. And that trend looks steady over time, so beyond 12 months. The efficacy of 2 doses of the Pfizer and Moderna is only 41% at its peak, and that's less than 3 months after the last dose. The efficacy of Pfizer and Moderna drops significantly over time. It actually drops to negative efficacy after 6 months. This
All right,
means you're
Emma,
more
I
likely
just
to
want to
get
make sure.
infected if you're vaccinated. Let me
Yeah,
finish,
Emma.
Travis. I got a couple more. I got one
Okay,
more.
just a couple more because I want to make sure we get responses to your actual.
Yeah,
Yes,
here,
just do
on-
them one at a time and and then Dr. Wilson
Yeah.
some time to respond.
With the booster, 3 doses, the efficacy is 58% at its peak. So that's, if you think about it in good terms, it's about 4% over natural immunity. So then that's the only argument you can make that it's a little bit more effective than natural immunity. But that decreases then within only 30 days down to 44%, which is 10% less than natural immunity. This suggests that the efficacy of 3 doses also wanes over time, and the only arguable benefit that you'd have in that scenario is less than 30 days. And that's not even the most alarming part. This suggests that over
Hang
time,
on, Emma.
vaccinated people will become even more susceptible to infection. This is also consistent with all the studies that were done in the
Emma.
UK and all their surveillance reports. So we've got to take new information and make new decisions, is my point. And as providers and medical experts in the industry, they need to issue guidance, and that guidance needs to be handed down immediately. Not wait 30 days, not wait 45. Immediate. New information needs new decisions to be made.
All right, let's get some responses to your claims here.
Okay.
Which one do we want to wrestle with first, there, Dan?
What would you prefer me to address first?
Whatever you. There was a lot there. I don't. I maybe I lost track of some of it.
Okay. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was not taken off the market completely. Its use was restricted, and there is now a preferential recommendation for mRNA vaccines. So the reason being is that because the Johnson & Johnson shot has that very tiny risk of that blood clotting disorder, again, we're trying to take the road of least risk. So mRNA vaccines don't have that risk because in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's actually because of a protein that's on the viral vector, and mRNA vaccines don't have a viral vector. So you can still get a Janssen vaccine if you elect to have it, or if you had an allergic reaction to an mRNA vaccine. So, you know, they're not dangerous. We just have better options. Okay, and you know, the press release from May 5th does acknowledge that the Johnson & Johnson vaccines do have an important role to play in the global immunization process for reasons including that it's easier to ship the J&J vaccine to underprivileged areas, developing nations that may not have as good of health infrastructure and capabilities to store vaccine. I guess you were talking about the New England Journal of Medicine study, effects of previous infection and vaccination on symptomatic Omicron infections, right? That's the latest one you posted in the chat. That is, again, like I've said a couple times, we have to remember efficacy against what? And this is
natural immunity. I already
infection.
stated that. I stated
And
54%.
in my opinion, I don't think we are really that concerned with infection because we know that over time, vaccines are not going to protect you against getting a positive test, and that's an infection. And nothing is going to protect you for a long time against getting infected. That's the biology of coronaviruses and our immune systems. What's important is preventing severe disease, because even if you get infected and your immune system responds to it quickly enough so that you don't get really sick, you don't need to go to the hospital, you don't go into the ICU, maybe you get runny nose, some symptoms, maybe you get a fever, maybe even miss work, you're still not going to the hospital. That's really good. So that's more important than infection. And that's what this paper, this NEJM paper, is looking at. If you look at several other papers that have monitored the efficacy of a 3-dose vaccine course against hospitalization and death, it remains very, very good for as long as we've measured it.
Well, Dan, you can't say there is no alternative.
Yes, we're always getting new information, but
is to do nothing.
Ultimately, that information continues to tell us that vaccination is both very effective and much safer than waiting to get the virus.
So, Dan, the alternative is to do nothing, which means to not take the shots. And given the new information I just provided you from that New England Journal of Medicine study on June 15th, to do nothing is more effective than to do something.
I think that's a mischaracterization. Emma, I think that's a strong mischaracterization of the paper that I'm looking at right here, the one you posted, because they're not saying that not doing anything. That's not the conclusion. The conclusion is very specific, talking about infection. But when we're speaking about vaccines, as Dr. Wilson has said, we're looking at not like severe infection, not going to the hospital. Waiting to get the virus is more dangerous than even, since the vaccines are so safe, just getting to doses is going to protect against severe infection. And that's the goal.
That's not true, because you could say, look, the healthy demographic, statistically speaking, has zero concerns from contracting COVID. Now, the only argument can be made looking at the data is to give it to extreme risk categories. That's it. I mean, here's a perfect example. The most recent study that the FDA just used to approve it from 6 months to 5-year-olds, right? There's 0 children that have died from COVID. 0.
No.
So
no. I'm not going to let you say that. That is not true. That is not true.
Okay, so are we gonna are we gonna say from COVID or with COVID? Because I guess we should probably distinguish between that too.
It's from COVID. That's how death certificates are filled out. COVID was a contributing cause to the death that resulted in a chain of events that caused the death. So that is from COVID. And as I said earlier, there are over 200 children ages 0 to 5 months who have died from COVID during the pandemic. That's not zero. You should not say that.
So let's look at the total amount that were profiled during that study. So out of the 4,500 that they profiled for the study, 3,000 of them dropped out. Why was
No,
that study continued to be allowed to be done and finished when that large of the study group dropped out?
Okay, so you're quoting from a video that features Dr. Claire Craig. I'm actually making a video that's going to be put on my YouTube channel on Tuesday about that. She is lying. The 3,000 did not drop out.
Where'd they go?
They were in the study. I'm going to link right now in the chat the FDA briefing document that describes all of the data. It describes where those children are in the study. A total of 58 children withdrew from the clinical trial, not 3,000. The reasons for their withdrawals are all listed, and all of the children that are remaining are accounted for, and the data for them are shown in tables and graphs. And for children of interest who had interesting cases, those are described in detail. So they didn't drop out. I know you probably heard Claire Craig say that, and you believed her, but I would really encourage you to not trust those kinds of claims at face value.
Well, it's a good consideration, Dan. I'd be happy if you'd share the link in the chat. I'd love to take a look at that tonight. If there's any kind of
It's right there.
contrary information that challenges anything that I've read myself, I'm always open to it. And I think vice versa, the medical community should be open to it too. I'd like to go back to the study from the New England Journal of Medicine. I mean, we have new data to suggest that they're not that effective at all.
The New England Journal of Medicine study again?
Yeah, the newest numbers. I mean, the only arguable comment you could make on that is to say, well, you need to get it, and you need to get them every 3 months. But are people really going to be willing to accept that sort of routine vaccination schedule? I don't think so. I mean, the vast majority of the people that I know that were vaccinated with the first and second dose, they're not getting a booster, not getting another one. I mean, they realized when most of the people that got the first shot thought that they wouldn't get COVID if they did, and that turned out not to be true. So there was this big push early on that this was going to be like an end-all solution. But if you need a routine schedule, a quarterly schedule, I just don't see a lot of buy-in for that. It just doesn't seem to be that effective.
I would agree, but the nice thing is we don't need to have a regular schedule. The only reason you would ever want to get boosted every 3 months is if you always want to prevent infection. And that's not a reasonable public health goal. The reasonable public health goal is to keep people out of the hospital and out of the morgue. And that's what these vaccines are doing really well. And just real quick, I'll quote from this study from the New England Journal of Medicine talking about infection, not hospitalization, severe disease, or death. Their results show that hybrid immunity resulting from previous infection and recent booster vaccination conferred the strongest protection. So if you want to have the strongest immune system possible, you wouldn't stop at infection, you would also get vaccinated.
All right, Emma, unless you had something quickly to add, we will move on to the next caller.
I don't have anything more to add. I appreciate your time, Travis. You've always put together some awesome rooms with some great content. Dan, thanks for your time. It's always awesome to hear some other perspectives on it. Appreciate your time, both of you.
Yeah, thanks for calling in.
Happy night.
All right, and let's finish up with Jason today. Jason, you're live with Dr. Dan Wilson.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, you bet.
Great. Hey, Dr. Wilson. I've bugged you on Facebook and Twitter, and watched a ton of your videos. Always enjoy the content. You're always like really helpful and patient with explaining concepts and everything. I really appreciate it. One of my questions was just so if COVID and vaccination, if these conversations magically go away and COVID goes away, are you going to be focusing on debunking other items? And is there anything you want to specifically focus on?
Oh yeah, totally. Appreciate that. Yeah, so I mean, when I started my channel, COVID, it was January of 2020. I think I uploaded my first video. COVID was like really not. It wasn't really moving. I think a lot of people at the time thought it wasn't going to go far. Thought a lot of people thought it might be a repeat of SARS-1. I kind of thought that way, but at that time I was covering anti-vaxxers like Del Bigtree. I think he's super fun to cover. He's just a wacky, like, Alex Jones figure in the anti-vaccine world. I mean, the guy does stuff like just takes a sack of rice and pours it out on his desk and then starts yelling at the camera about all these viruses. Oh man, he's so wacky. So yeah, totally. If COVID disappeared tomorrow, I would definitely keep doing my videos, just covering, the people like Del Bigtree, because he's fun. He's an awful person, but he's so fun to cover.
Yeah, another
Anything
question.
else there, Jason? Yeah, go ahead.
Just in your last video, you claimed that The Room was the greatest movie ever made. Has anybody tried to fight you on that yet?
I've gotten a lot of agreement, actually, because The Room is the best movie ever made.
The Room is brilliant. It's just brilliant.
Yeah,
I can't say that without laughing, but yeah. Oh man, such a wacky, goofy movie.
Well,
so
but even more wacky and goofy is the man himself, Tommy Wiseau.
Oh my god, I know. I actually read the book, The Disaster Artist, that the more recent movie was based on.
Yeah.
I think it's written by the guy who plays Mark in the movies, and he's actually like really good friends with Tommy in the real world. That he tells all these stories about Tommy and just how strange he is. He's such a weird dude.
Yeah, if you haven't watched it yet,
it's endearing.
Yeah. If you haven't watched it yet, do look into Tommy Wiseau's. I think it's a vampire musical. I don't know if it's a musical, but but he did something where he's a vampire, and I thought it was another brilliant piece by him.
I think I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember the name of it. It was also really weird.
Oh, yeah, big time.
And this is after the Room, I guess? Must be, right?
Yeah. He did like one thing after The Room before he realized that like people like it because it's a joke. So
right.
Oh, it's just this one series on Hulu.
I mean, I can't imagine being his position. You think you did something great, and then people are just like,
yeah,
we just like it. It's bad.
Yeah, but he kind of started owning it and calling it black comedy. So
yeah, he did.
So that's kind of good. All right, well let's let Jason go. Thank you very much, Jason.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Really appreciate the call. So in closing here, Dan, is the recommendation that everyone should get vaccinated against COVID? That's my belief. And my moral foundation is to maximize well-being for myself and those around me. And I happen to be in a position where, I have a bit of an audience, and that's been my moral prescription to everyone. Do you guys agree?
Yeah. Yes.
I would agree. Yeah, 100%. I think that we have an obligation, not just to us, but the most vulnerable people around us, and for something that is very, very safe and has been shown to be effective. I think not doing that in a way kind of separates us from ourselves, because we live in a community and we would want other people to be there for us in the same way that we could be there for them. I mean, that's really, it's a very like lovey-dovey platitude, but I really think it holds true.
Yeah, and I think that in the spirit of choosing the road of less risk, vaccination is definitely the way to go. We don't want to just accept suffering. We don't want to just accept deaths that can be prevented, and extend that out to deaths caused by the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, for example. We don't want to accept that suffering, so we make pauses, we make preferential recommendations, we make restrictions, we change our course when new data come in, and always trying to take the road of less risk. And as long as COVID is circulating among the populations, getting vaccinated is going to be the road of less risk.
Dan, thank you so much for joining Don and I today. I deeply appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much. It was very enlightening and fun.
Thanks so much for having me, Travis. This was fun. I really enjoyed it.
You bet. We'll have to do it again. Guys, it's Noam Chomsky tomorrow at 3 p.m. Pacific time. I will sit down with Noam and we are going to talk about some of the most basic fundamental questions in philosophy. Make sure you subscribe to the Pangburn Hangout here. Those of you on YouTube, thank you so much for listening in. Everyone subscribe. I gave you guys the Discord link so you can come and join us for the after party discussion. And I think that's it. Don, a pleasure as always.
A pleasure. Thank you guys so much. Thanks,
you,
guys. Professor Wilson.